I started with a partner 4 years ago. We're going into our fifth year, a school to teach adults who are refugees and immigrants in Minnesota, and particularly in northeast Minnesota, how to speak English. And the reason that I got the idea and got excited about it was that I've been a judge. I'm a retired judge now, and I've been a judge in Anoka County for 24 years. And later then, I worked as a senior judge in Hennepin County, and it was particularly in Hennepin County that I saw many people, particularly women, Somali women, and Latinas, who spoke no English. And they would come to court, and we have wonderful interpreters, but before they reached the interpreter, they would often be talking with me or with somebody. And the worst ones were when they were in on domestic abuse. And the person who had committed the domestic abuse was with them and was their interpreter. And I just thought, this just is not right. These women need to learn English so that they can protect themselves, really, and also become more a part of our community. So my partner, who is Spanish-speaking and a teacher in the Minneapolis public schools for many years, and I started this school. She taught Spanish. That's what made us the money. I taught ESL, and later it evolved into teaching citizenship as well. The stories I heard from so many of my students were fear of police, which got me to thinking and eventually programming Spanish for police officers, which we're doing right now. And what I tell the police officers is people's brains, even if you speak English, people's brains turn to ice and they can't think when a police officer stops them. In particular, people who have come from different worlds where they're afraid of police. And so if you just knew a little of their language, to talk with them and calm them down and let them know that you care enough about them that you've actually learned some of their language, that will help your situation immensely. We also teach Spanish to doctors and to nurses and to people who work in clinics, and for the same reason. And we just started a Somali class, again for the same reason. There's so many people in this world who do not speak English. And Minnesota has 80,000 probably Somali refugees. We have, well, this country is becoming almost 50% Spanish speaking. And so I think in order for us to all communicate with one another, we need to know some of each other's language. So as much as I want the students I have, the immigrants and the refugees that I teach, to speak English, I also want the rest of us to speak at least a little Somali, a little Spanish, a little Hmong. We don't teach that yet, but it's another language that's predominant in Minnesota. And my desire really is for communication. Communication will answer a lot of our problems. It won't solve them necessarily, but it will be a start. And if people can communicate, perhaps with the Somali population particularly, they might better understand that Muslims are people of peace, and that they're people who want to be a part of the community. And if you speak to them with a little Somali, you'd be surprised at how delighted they are that you're starting to speak their language. I continue to do work in Hennepin County as a judge, and I still see people who are in need. But I see police officers and I see probation officers. And they deal, again, with particularly with Spanish-speaking people. And so now I've opened up this program for police for or Spanish for police, I've opened it up to all kinds of law enforcement, like probation officers, social workers, child protection workers, and so we have a number of different people, adults who are learning Spanish and really enjoying it because they come back and they say, you know, I used it today. And it really works. It really relaxed my client, and I discovered that my client speaks a little more English than I thought. Well, it's because they're relaxed, and then they're ready to meet you halfway. We also have opened it up to people who work at the front desk. They probably are the people who see and deal with people on the first time they enter a government building, a police department. And so the people at the front desk are interested now, even though they're not sworn police officers. So we have somebody from Brooklyn Center who has started to come because she just wants to be able to say hello and how are you and a few other questions to Somali people who come in and to Spanish-speaking people. I must say that for me, it's like a cycle for my life because I started out as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nigeria, West Africa, teaching. And there, even though I was not an English major, I was a French major, they wanted me to teach English because everybody who spoke and was native to an English language, they wanted us to teach the kids. And so I feel like I've started from those days and come round full cycle to teaching again. And it has been a journey. It's really been a fun journey. I've met so many people who have told me stories about how they got here and how they survived refugee camps and how they survived crossing the desert and crossing the Rio Grande. And many of them almost died. Many of them, well, frankly, many of the women were raped, or they saw their family members or their friends raped, and they couldn't do anything about it. So I'm dealing with a lot of women in particular who probably are suffering from PTSD, and yet they've survived. And they're there and they're working so hard. And so it makes me sad when I hear people lump people all together and say, oh, these people are terrible, they're taking jobs away from us, and they're really, they just walk into the country. Well, that's not true. They barely survive trying to get here. And they have family at home, and they're always trying to take care of their family. The Somalis, in particular, do still have family in refugee camps. And they're trying constantly. They're working and they're sending money to Kenya so that they can take care of those people who have been living in refugee camps, some of them since, well, the Civil War started in 1991. So you figure out how many years that is. And one of my students told me one day, I got this phone call from Africa, from my cousin in Kenya, who's in a refugee camp, and you know, they all think that we just roll out of bed here in the U.S., and then there's a pile of money sitting there waiting for us. And so they want us to send money because they think that we just are loaded with money. The reason that I came to starting this school was for somewhat, I suppose, noble reasons. I wanted communication. I wanted people to be able to communicate. And the reason I keep going is not for any of those reasons. The reason I keep going is that I am having so much fun. I'm really, really enjoying the people I'm getting to know, and I'm enjoying the lights in their eyes when they begin to understand. I love it when they come into class and they say, "Teacher, I have something I've heard, and I don't know what it is. It's somebody said to me, I wanna," because I'm gonna. And I had to laugh because, of course, that's the way Americans talk. And I had to explain to them, wanna means want to, and gonna means going to. And I don't want you ever to say that because people won't understand you, but you need to understand them. And so it's a constant with people coming in with these various things that Americans say because we slur our words together. I had a Buddhist monk for 2 years. I'm so sad because he had to go back to India where his monastery is. But he was absolutely delightful, and he really raised, in some instances, the level of the class because he had the most interesting questions. And he would give me gifts now and then, and one of them was he saw that I was always losing my keys. And so he brought me something that he made, very colorful with ribbons, 5 or 6 different color ribbons, and then beaded that he'd done together, and it attached to my keys. And he said, "Here you go, teacher. You'll never lose your keys again." And I believe he put a Buddhist something on it because, of course, they're brightly colored, and of course I find them pretty easily, but I have never lost my keys since he left 6 months ago. And I think of him every day when I use those keys. He was pretty sad because he missed India. He missed his home, and yet he was Tibetan, and his home was a refugee camp where he grew up. And he confessed to me one day that at age 10, his parents, who I thought had sent him to the monastery because they wanted him to get a better education, he said, no, he said, I was so bad when I was in school, in the refugee camp, that the teachers kept complaining about me. And so finally my parents said, okay, you're going to the monastery where they will make sure that you behave yourself. And so he became a monk at age 10. And I ask him often, how do you feel about that? And he said, I really love it. And I miss it, and I want to go back home. He was here just on assignment to take care of the Buddhist population in Minneapolis. And I had no idea there were so many people, Tibetans in particular, who are Buddhist, and it's a large population. So through my students, I'm learning a lot about the rest of the world here in Minneapolis. You know, we live in a society, we tend to hang out with each other, and you get to know certain friends who know certain friends. But it's a very, very small world when you discover that there are so many other groups out there, and they're our neighbors. And so I guess my belief in communication and languages is still strong, but I don't know how we're ever going to learn all the languages of the people who live here in Minneapolis, because there are just so many different groups of people. I started out, as I said, I think, in the Peace Corps in Nigeria right after college, and it was we were one of the first groups in Nigeria. And when I came back to the U.S. after that experience, I had learned a little bit of Yoruba, which was the language of the main group of people I was with. And I came back to a country that was embroiled in racial difficulties. And it was not difficult for me because there were other things broiling too. It wasn't just racial, it was the Vietnam War, and it was, I was teaching then a group of children in Pennsylvania in the Appalachians who were, in those days we called it mentally retarded, but they were from one very low level to a pretty high level with some psychological problems. And that was another whole group, Appalachia, that I really didn't know anything about. They were actually much worse off than the people I worked with in Nigeria. They were poor, the kids didn't have shoes, and this was the USA. I was shocked. I went to Australia after that for a couple of years to teach. And when I came back, the Vietnam War was winding down. And I came back from Australia to Minnesota, where I became a social worker in Hennepin County. And there was another whole area of group of people. I had no idea how difficult their lives were. And they were Native Americans, people who had been forced onto reservations, and many of them, of course, came down from the reservations to Minneapolis. And a lot of the kids I dealt with on my caseload, I did child protection, and I dealt with a lot of kids whose parental rights had been terminated, and they were Native American, and I tried reuniting some of them with their families. I reunited one young woman with her brother who had been adopted by a white family, who were furious with me. And I never realized how furious they were until several years later, after I was no longer a social worker. I'd actually gone to law school, and I went into their store. They had a store down in, I think it was in Burnsville, I can't remember, it was one of the southern suburbs. And I reminded them who I was, and they wanted me out of their store. They would not allow me even to stay with my husband at the time. They were so angry at me for having reunited those two. Interesting, they felt like they had saved this boy, and he should not have anything to do with that terrible, group of people. So, I also learned a lot about the Native American culture, not only up on the reservation, but also down in the cities. And there were people who worked very, very hard to get Native American kids a good education. They started schools, and they were Native American themselves, and they worked hard for their own community. My life has been, I get surprised every time I meet another group of people that I had no idea. Not so much that I didn't know they existed, but I guess I just did not know enough in depth about what they were about and what they were doing. After I became a lawyer, I was a public defender in Hennepin County. And I continued with this familiarity with Native Americans because one of my jobs was seeing people in the jail for the first time in the morning after they've been arrested the night before. And I would say that about 80% of the people I saw were Native American. And the reason they were there, drinking in public. And they were picked up, roughed up, and brought into the jail. The roughing up I saw as a real pattern with the Minneapolis police. And part of their excuse, I think, was that the judges wouldn't do anything about it anyway, so they were taking a little bit of their own justice in hand. So primarily who I saw in the morning were African Americans and Native Americans. And they were all young. I'd say 18, 19, or very old in the case of the Native Americans in particular. And most of them probably had some form of drinking problem or drugs, maybe not so much, but alcohol primarily. And the police truly, I went and complained about it to the chief of police, who was Bozo at the time. Bozo. I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but in any event, he was supposed to be a really good chief of police. But I think that during that era, there was an awful lot of thumping going on. And eventually, I left the public defender's office and went to Anoka as a prosecutor. We had an exchange with the public defender's office and the Anoka prosecutors. So I went out to Anoka, and that was a whole different world. It was predominantly white. One of my friends came out from Hennepin County from the public defender's office to watch me in a trial, in a jury trial, and I was trying, as a prosecutor, I was trying a burglar. And at the end of the trial, he walked out with me and he said, "You know, I think that's the first white burglar I've seen." And it just showed you the difference between Hennepin and Anoka. There was a very, not just white, but very, very redneck atmosphere out there. I found it pretty challenging, and I also kind of liked a lot of the people that were there and were trying to make it better. And so eventually I became a judge in Anoka County. And the surprising thing for people was that I was appointed by a Republican governor, Al Quie. The fact that you get appointed, usually, not always, Alan Page is a good example, he ran for the Supreme Court, but usually you get appointed by the governor for the first position open as judge. And Al Quie knew that I was actually a charter member of the DFL Feminist Caucus. And yet, after talking with me, he appointed me because he felt like I would do a fair and good job. And I've always felt a real special feeling about Al Quie, that he did not allow politics to get in his way. The only other governor that I really felt appointed judges in that way was Jesse Ventura, of all people. I once spoke to Jesse, and I said to him, "Governor, I have to tell you that you have done some really wonderful appointments to the bench." And what he said was, "You know, I don't really know very much about the courts, and so I take advice from people who I consider know something about it, and I trust their judgment, but then I interview people, and I trust my instincts about who I think is going to be a really good person, and it has nothing to do with politics." So that was Jesse Ventura, who did an awful lot of things that people disapproved of. But I'll tell you, I think he appointed some of the best judges in Minnesota. Eventually, I served in Anoka County for 24 years. And then I met my husband, having divorced my other husband, my previous husband, about 12 years before. I met Frank Stone, and he was a local artist. And he and I started an art gallery in Minneapolis, in Northeast. And that was the beginning of us being in Northeast. And we had Frank Stone Gallery. And it started getting bigger and bigger. And pretty soon I was doing two jobs. I was being a judge in Anoka, and I was trying to run this art gallery. And I decided to retire a little bit early so that I could do the art scene. And that was another whole group of people. I had no idea there were so many artists all over, especially all over Northeast. And I think we showed in our art gallery over 300 local artists. And those were wonderful days. We had so much fun. Northeast was just really coming into its own as an art district. And we felt like we were a part of it. And so we really were developing the arts here. The gallery was very much a part of that whole art in Northeast movement. And then, unfortunately, 2008 occurred. And if you remember 2008, it was everything just went downhill financially. And we didn't sell art to rich people. We sold art to middle-class people. And they were the ones, the architects and the teachers and the social workers, the secretaries, the dentists, the dental assistants, all that sort of level of professional and not so professional bought art from us because we never sold anything much over $1,000, and they couldn't afford it anymore. And so we closed the gallery, and I went back to work in Hennepin County, and that is when I decided to go and get my ESL certification and open this school. And here we are, into the school, going into our 5th year. And that's my story.
How does the school work as a financial thing?
Badly.
I didn't think it was.
No.
I didn't think it was like getting a real estate license, quite
No.
in terms of picking up your financial fortunes.
No, not at all. My husband says that everything I do I make less money and less money and less money. The gallery wasn't a big money maker either, but the school is even worse. The financial part, this was our business plan. We were going to teach Spanish and make money at that. And that was going to pay for the ESL. It was a pretty simple plan. And we got a lot of friends and family initially donated money. And then the first year we got a grant from the Minneapolis Women's Club that helps women-run organizations to get a kickstart. And so that was great. That helped. And we had a fundraiser. We made some money there. And then I started expanding it and trying to get, first of all, citizenship. And then we decided to do this thing for the police, and that we're doing it for free. Right now, anyway. And we got another grant. We got a grant, small grants, from the Wells Fargo, from Thrivent, and then some of our friends took money out of their family foundation, small, very small, and we'd get $1,000 here and $1,000 there, and then people would give us money and it would match. So they give $500, we get $1,000. It was just little bits and pieces. And then we got a nice grant from the Otto Bremer Trust for about $12,000, but we still haven't hit a really big grant. And it's really been mostly family and friends, and then the greater world as we expanded, who see us on Facebook. We do a lot of mailings. People discover us through friends of friends and so forth. But that's pretty much it. It's we got I was asked to speak at with a small group of people, maybe about 50 women artists, right after President Trump was elected. And they were all moaning and groaning and what they were going to do as artists. And they got to me, I was on the panel, and I said, I love Donald Trump. And you could have heard a pin drop in that room. They're just aghast. And then I laughed and I said, because I received so much money for the school right after that election, because everybody wanted to do something, and particularly they wanted to do something for immigrants. And so we did get a lot of money donated from people I didn't even know. And it expanded out way beyond the family and friends we've been counting on. So, it's just different things, but it's mostly begging for money because we really don't make enough money teaching Spanish, teaching Somali, because we have to pay the teachers. And we pay them a good... We're not cheap with our teachers. And then Chinese, we get a certain amount every month from the Chinese teacher. But that just doesn't cover it. I feel like I'm NPR right now. Family and friends, give, please. So that's our business plan, which sounded good in the beginning, but it's been tough. It's been very tough. And we're back to doing applications for grants again, and we'll just keep doing that. I have a wonderful friend, Tony Brown, who is a grant writer by profession. And when we were having a really tough time, he volunteered to do all of my grant writing. I have to help him, of course, to provide information and so forth, but he goes online and does all the really hard work. So we've had really good luck with people coming in, and we have volunteers who come in and they do work for us. So the volunteers have been great. And certain ones even, I have one volunteer who comes in 3 days a week and teaches an ESL class. Another volunteer, in fact, the person who's teaching the police is a volunteer. He's a policeman from Ecuador who's here for a couple of years on a student visa. And he volunteered to do that, and it's really worked well. Another volunteer is going to be teaching computer classes. And Eastside Neighborhood Services, through their employment, they have senior employment program. And they will place, in organizations like ours in the community, they will place people for training. And we have had, kind of on a regular basis, we've had a receptionist for 20 hours a week that Eastside Neighborhood Services pays for as long as we do the training. And people learn how and then go off and get other jobs, and they get paid more. So that's worked really well for us, too.
I it's hard to imagine a more ideal life, except maybe my own. In the matters that count to me. I mean, you keep every so often. It's like sticking a shovel in a new bunch of dirt and turning up a new can of worms.
That's so true.
Keep
Yeah.
going like that and getting yourself exactly in a position to have the kinds of conversations one wants to have, which actually is what this camera's about too. It's a heavenly thing if you can, if you can make your retirement cover it till you die.
Yeah, that's right.
I should think that would probably be the ticket. So I find it all just outrageously exciting and enticing. You must be meeting the people along the way who could be good communicators to the audiences that need to be communicated to. I mean, you must be meeting the police officers who could talk to the community and have them listen. That's just what wanting to learn a language is all about,
Sure.
I suppose.
Yeah.
And likewise, the Somalis who could, and the Spanish speakers who could. I mean, not all of them, but some. Is there any way of getting those stories out to the wider world? Or those attitudes infecting the wider police department? Or tempering the wider judiciary, or whatever these things? I mean, you see, you got a corner on the story market, but it seems like one of those things it's not particularly good to have a monopoly on, given in a society in which this information and these attitudes are absolutely essential. So, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with you. I wish and hope that stories are told to the outside world. One of the things that has happened, I think it takes a while for people to show interest in what you're doing, but one of the things that is seeming to happen, for instance, about the police, is that Ibrahim Hirsi, who writes about immigrant issues for MinPost, came out. Actually, he's come out twice, and he's done 2 stories about us. One was about the influx of large numbers of people wanting to get their citizenship right after the election. The other was he did a story just recently about the police learning Spanish. And then that story appeared in MinPost, and that same day, I think, I got a call from CCO Radio, and they wanted to do a story about the police learning Spanish. I think, the problem with getting people interested in spreading the word is something I probably don't really know how to do. I've never been a very good marketer, and I've just hired somebody who I hope is eventually going to take over for me in this school, who is pretty good at that, and I have somebody else that just joined our board who's also good at that. But you need, in order for people to hear the story, you have to have something like this. You have to have somebody with a camera and a microphone who's interested in hearing the story and broadcasting it to somebody. I suppose we could have somebody come in and do a series of YouTubes. I don't know. I don't really know. I'm just not that. I don't know what I can do other than to tell people like you about all of this, and hopefully have the story heard by other people. And then they do what CCO did, for example. They heard the story and then they wanted to talk about it. How do you get stories out to the greater world?
Let's talk about for a minute, this might be embarrassing, but you can always steer away from it if you want. Let's talk about judges for a minute. I've known some really good ones. I lived with Rosalie Wall for a couple of years.
Oh, really?
So I've talked to the best.
Yes, you have.
And I actually tried to get on a jury in front of Frank Knoll a long time ago. Got a good sense of him. I really have a lot of respect for the ones I know, with a couple of exceptions. But I guess what I want to know is, what do you think they need? I'm thinking of the people in the jobs that you've been in. They're seeing the whole range of human misery.
Yeah.
There's the complexity. They're having to try to sort it out. And, their law school likely didn't prepare them for that.
That's for sure.
And certainly the attitudes, if I can get a whiff of it from my young friends who want to become judges. The attitude that leads them to want to climb that particular ladder is not an outpouring of goodwill.
Yeah, that's true.
It has a lot to do with the black robe. It has
Right.
a lot to do with being up there and getting to say.
Mm-hmm.
So what do judges need?
What judges need is a much greater education than going to law school. And unfortunately, the ones who go directly from law school into a law firm or into, well, I guess, say law firm or corporation, being a corporate lawyer, I think are the worst judges. They're actually, I shouldn't say that. They're very good, some of them, at very complex litigation with lots of lawyers and money being the main problem and goal. But as far as working with at the level of just people, and all of them have to do that at one time or another. In Minnesota in particular, we don't have individual separate courts. There's no judge, even in Hennepin County where they have separate assignments, there's no judge that doesn't eventually have to do juvenile court, family court, criminal court, and then they of course do the civil complex litigation, but frankly that's not the biggest and most pressing need in the courts. The most pressing need is in the criminal courts and in the family courts. And of course juvenile, I'm kind of putting that into family court, but I probably shouldn't. And I think the problem with most judges is that they have not had really good life experience before they become a judge. That's what I found with my colleagues. The ones who had not gone to law school right away and it had been out teaching or doing almost anything else had a better life experience and tended to be better judges. The ones who were in my mind, and they were friends, but they were terrible in terms of their interaction with people in the courtroom. And the black robe thing, they were just obnoxious, some of them, and treated people very unkindly. Were primarily men, although I'm sure there are women now, but there weren't that many women when I was on the court. They were men who had done just what I said. They undergraduate school, then they went to law school, and then they went immediately into law firms, corporate attorneys. What else do you do? I mean, attorneys for the state government. Not anything where you would really be involved with the kind of people that I felt I had experience with. And I think it made me a much better judge because I understood that that people from all walks of life at one time or another eventually end up in the courtroom for one reason or another, and that I tried to tell my fellow judges, I'd say, you walk into a hospital, do you feel comfortable? I don't. It's just not my milieu. I'm nervous, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, or where this department is or that department. And these people who come into court, that's what it's like for them, and they're scared because also there's an outcome that might be really negative for them. And if you don't treat people with dignity, they're not going to respond with dignity. That was always my feeling. And I always tried really hard to treat people no matter, and part of it too, as a public defender, you really did see people who were totally, totally guilty. I had a guy who killed a woman, 80 years old, 18 stab wounds. You would think, horrible, how could you stand to even defend him? And this guy was a young guy, he was only 19 years old, and he was terrified. And I didn't like what he did, but I had so much sympathy for him. If you never saw a person like that and realized you were the only one in the world at that point who cared about him as his attorney, you just haven't, it's impossible for you to understand and be sympathetic towards the defendant. Because there's no question he did a horrible thing. But there's always a piece of life to somebody, a piece of humanity, and there was for that poor kid. And, you know, if you're not willing to look at that, as a judge in a courtroom, if you're not willing to look at the humanity in people, then I don't think that you can be a very good judge. I don't think you can sentence very well. I don't think you can make determinations, even about the law, because you're so prejudiced against the defendant. So, how you get that word across to people, I mean, I used to talk to my fellow judges, but I never felt like I could convince them of anything, because we were all individuals. We were all elected and appointed and so forth, and we all were on equal standing. And I certainly wasn't going to lecture to them, much as I wanted to sometimes.
There's another piece of the story I'm aware of, not having my crimes uncovered as readily as some people do. I manage to stay out of court as a defendant, but every so often, and they'll never put a philosopher on the jury, but they don't know that, so they keep dragging me in.
Yeah.
And the amount of civic education that a good judge does, truly astonishing. The amount of just letting people know how the system works. I mean, you only encounter the system in a traffic stop and in a courtroom, basically. Yeah. So all your attitudes are shaped there. It's really astonishing. Let me try. I have a fantasy. I expect it's false, but I have a fantasy that the governor watches this show. He could, if he wanted to. All he'd have to do is turn to 6 on his dial. I'm sure he gets cable, being a Dayton and all. Now, I can see 2 ways of fixing the problem you're describing. I'm wondering which one of them seems to you most promising or realistic or something. One is to get people like you and Rose Lee and other folks who took the trouble to get this kind of broad experience onto the bench, which is a change in how appointments happen. And the other is to educate the other bozos who don't have this, sorry, but I get to say it, and the other folks who don't have this experience, and try to gradually bring them along with some notion of who it is that's coming before them. Which of those do you think will work? Is there any hope for continuing judicial education being anything but a sort of burden and a joke?
No, I think continuing judicial education is a good thing. And I think that the state Supreme Court is responsible for an annual conference, and I think they try very hard to not only educate the judges at that conference, where most of the state court judges do attend, and I think what they do is they try very hard to educate them both in the continuing law that's constantly moving and changing, and we have to keep up with that. But they also do a lot of different kinds of programs talking about specific areas of the law and the kind of people that you deal with. And I think recently, I mean, such courses as how you deal with Somalis or Muslims in the courtroom. Is there something different about that? And they have people from the Muslim community, the Somali community. And I say Muslim community Somali because they're Egyptians, and I mean, I've had students from various countries that are Muslim. So that part of it, they're trying to at least encourage judges to look at the cultural differences of people. But I think for the most part, and then they have programs where you should look at yourself and see how you react to people and what kind of personalities you have and what you do about that in terms of how you act on the bench. Probably it's pretty difficult, I think, to educate people. It's like knowing a language. If you want to learn a language fluently, you got to live in that country for a while. And even then, it's going to be hard. So how do you get a person to react to the humanity of people if that person hasn't lived amongst the people, many people? You know, what you have is you have judges who live in suburbs, and they deal with people who are pretty much like themselves. And occasionally they have one friend maybe who's different, and then they come on the bench, and they've worked in a society that's like that. I don't know what you do, other than you get the governor to try and pick people who have had wider variety of experiences, and don't necessarily pick people who are so legally brained that that's all they know. Because frankly, the law is not that difficult. You can learn the law, but I don't think that you can learn about people and humanity without having lived it. It's not something that's in a textbook.
Is anybody lobbying on judicial appointments? I mean, not particular ones, but on general policy for judicial appointments? Is there any pressure on, let's say, Dayton from just that point
Perspective. Of view? You know, they pick commissions, and the commissions pick people who they think are going to be good judges. And I don't know what their basis is, quite honestly. I know that what I said to the governor was exactly what I'm saying to you. You know, these other people who want to be judges went directly into and work in the law. I didn't even go to law school for 12 years after college. And I raised a family, and I did this and I did that, and, you know, explained it. And I said, and I think I know a lot more and have a better feeling for making the right kind of decisions about people. That's what I told him. And he said in the end, yeah, I think you're right. And that's the only thing I can say to a governor is I think that you should look at people who actually have life experience as opposed to legal experience. Because anybody can learn the law. It's in a book. You can read it. I've never had trouble figuring out what the law should be. But not everybody can read people.
I've always wondered what the country goes through cycles of welcoming and fear, and when they're in fear they forget that they were ever welcoming, and when they're welcoming they can't imagine that anybody but the Nazis would ever be as fearful as they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And that just kind of keeps happening. But in the climate we're in right now, without referencing particular people, but I think the climate's pretty obvious from a lot of things coming together. The public climate, the noise, the note that's being sounded at the highest levels. Could you be comfortable going on the bench full time? I mean, as somebody who, among other things, is going to have to enforce whatever Washington thinks up.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a way of being humane in that job right now?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think there is. What you have to tell yourself, though, is that you're a state court judge, not a Supreme Court judge. And I mean supreme at the highest level. I mean the U.S. Supreme Court. And you have to deal with what the U.S. Supreme Court says, and yet you don't have to. I had a fight for the longest time, I guess I didn't mention this, with the fact that we in Minnesota were not we weren't thinking about the consequences of some of the sentencings that we did in terms of immigration, and that there were collateral consequences to certain things, and that we should pay attention to that. It took a long time, and I fought with the appellate court, and I fought with the county attorney in Anoka, because they just would not agree with me. And so I found many ways to keep that case, one particular case, going and going for 7 years. Even after I retired, I came back and finally was able to deal with it, because there were just ways that I could fight it and get it continued and continued and continued. And there was a lawyer who I really, really respected, who was doing pro bono work with this family. And it was a family that was going to be sent back to Chechnya, a young couple. And they were going to go back to Chechnya and probably be killed. That was pretty much what everybody knew. And yet, what we were doing in the court, in the state court, was what was going to send them back. They were going to be deported if they were convicted of this felony that the prosecutor insisted upon. There were other cases where, and I won't tell you in detail what we did, but it eventually worked out. And the people were not deported because they didn't get a felony. And it was only because I was willing to just keep fighting it. And there were ways in which I could we contacted our senators. That took time. Then they didn't help. And then we contacted another person and another. And it just and it said 7 years. It took 7 years. And it just finally wore the county attorney down. This is what it did. And that was, there was another case, a person who was Hmong, and he already got his letter. And it was cockfighting. Cockfighting is a felony in this state. And it took 4 judges. Luckily, they were friends of mine, and each one of them had a part in it. And we finally kept this man who had been here for 25 years, owned property, had a good job, raised a family, and they arrested him on cockfighting, and he had never gotten his citizenship because his English he felt it was never good enough. So he would have been deported because he could have gotten citizenship, but he was still, just at the stage below that where they could still deport him.